Okay, let's dive into this. If you think classic 19th century literature is just, dense, dusty prose, you might want to think again. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking what's widely considered one of the greatest novels ever written, Fyodor Dostoevsky's 1880 masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. It's actually a gripping, true crime-style murder mystery wrapped up in some of the most profound philosophical and psychological explorations of human existence ever put to paper. Seriously, this story makes your absolute worst Thanksgiving family drama look incredibly tame. We're going to break down exactly how Dostoevsky pulls this off, mapping out a wild narrative of faith, free will, morality, and justice. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the toxic Karamazov family drama, jump right into the thrilling murder and trial, and then peel back the layers to examine the divided human soul. After that, we'll tackle the heavy hitters, faith, freedom, and doubt, before wrapping up with the novel's enduring literary legacy. Part 1. The Karamazov family drama. Setting the stage in 19th century provincial Russia, we meet a family that literally redefines the word dysfunctional. The Karamazovs are bound by blood, sure, but they are totally poisoned by their patriarch, Fyodor Pavlovich. This guy is an immoral, greedy, drunken father whose sheer selfishness just infects everyone around him. He completely abandoned his kids emotionally, leaving behind this massive wake of resentment that basically sets the stage for the entire narrative.
Now, what's really interesting here is how these four sons perfectly map to psychological archetypes. Each brother represents a completely different dimension of human nature, reacting in his own unique way to their dad's lifelong neglect. You've got Dmitri, the eldest, who is entirely ruled by passion, emotion, and desire. Then there's Ivan, the intellectual middle son, driven by strict reason and deep skepticism. Alyosha, the youngest legitimate son, operates as the moral center of the story through pure compassion, love, and faith. And finally, lurking in the shadows, we have Pavel Smerdyakov, the family servant and Fyodor's illegitimate son, who embodies this quiet, calculating nihilism.
Which brings us to part 2, the murder and trial. Let's see how all this builds, because this psychological tension, it's an absolute powder keg just waiting for a spark. And that spark ignites a fast-paced, true crime narrative that culminates in the inevitable demise of the patriarch.
If we look at the timeline leading up to the crime, the tension is just suffocating. For a whole year, Dmitri and his father have been locked in this vicious rivalry, constantly fighting over Dmitri's inheritance and over a charismatic woman named Grushenka, who, incredibly, they both desire. A week before the murder, Dmitri's violent temper boils over and he actually makes public threats against his father's life. Then one night, Fyodor Pavlovich is murdered. Just an hour later, Dmitri, who desperately needed money, remember, is seen fleeing with a massive amount of cash. Naturally, he becomes the prime suspect and gets arrested. The whole thing culminates in one of literature's absolute greatest courtroom scenes, and the circumstantial evidence against Dmitri is frankly overwhelming. The prosecution and the defense both construct these incredibly convincing narratives based on the plain facts. He threatened his father, he desperately needed money, he fled immediately, and he suddenly had a ton of cash. But here is the tragic irony of it all. Dmitri is actually innocent of the murder itself, yet he gets convicted because the appearances so strongly suggest guilt. Dostoevsky is using this to show us that human legal justice often fails, and that true justice is internal, spiritual, and tied to our own conscience.
So who actually did it? Well, the hidden truth is that the quiet, calculating, illegitimate son, Smerdyakov, committed the crime, but his motive is what makes this a total masterpiece. Smerdyakov acted on the intellectual ideas of his half-brother Ivan. Ivan had been arguing that, without God, everything is permitted. Smerdyakov took this abstract philosophy, fully believed it justified murder, and actually acted on it. He confesses this privately to Ivan before committing suicide, which forever links Ivan's thoughts to Smerdyakov's destructive actions. It's a pretty chilling reminder of how dangerous abstract ideas can be when they're finally put into practice.
Moving into part 3, the divided human soul. This revelation completely shatters Ivan. He realizes that even though he didn't physically kill his father, his ideas inspired the crime. This brings us to a core theme of the novel. The Karamazov family ultimately symbolizes the divided human soul, and the realization of his own moral culpability triggers Ivan's complete psychological collapse.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dialectical contrast at the heart of the book. Look at Ivan on one side and Alyosha on the other. Ivan represents reason. He seeks logical consistency above all else, but his total reliance on intellectual doubt is exactly what leads to his breakdown. Alyosha, on the other hand, studying under his spiritual mentor, Father Zosima, represents living faith. His strength isn't intellectual superiority, it's deep empathy and compassion. Dostoevsky is showing us that good and evil aren't just external forces fighting out there in the world, they're impulses that coexist within every single human heart. Every major character in the story embodies both noble and destructive tendencies.
Part 4. Faith, Freedom, and Doubt. Now, Dostoevsky doesn't just preach to the reader here. He dives headfirst into some of the most difficult philosophical discussions imaginable. In exploring faith, freedom, and doubt, he never portrays faith as some simple, easy certainty. He gives intellectual doubt profound respect, actually giving Ivan some of the most compelling arguments against religion ever written.
Take this famously powerful stance from Ivan. During a deep conversation with Alyosha, Ivan argues that the suffering of innocent children makes believing in a just God morally impossible. He essentially says that even if God exists, and even if there's an ultimate harmony at the end of time, the price of that harmony, the suffering of the innocent, is just way too high. So he respectfully returns his ticket to the universe. It is a profound, earth-shattering intellectual revolt against divine justice.
Ivan then goes on to tell the legendary parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Christ returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition, but instead of being welcomed, he's imprisoned by the Church. Why? Because as the Inquisitor argues, human beings simply can't handle the freedom Christ offered them. Freedom involves moral choice, doubt, and responsibility, which is frankly terrifying. People would much rather trade their freedom for security and simple rules. It's an impulse we still see in society every single day, when people surrender their critical thinking just to belong to a comfortable group. It's Dostoevsky's brilliant way of showing that freedom is humanity's greatest gift, but simultaneously its heaviest, most terrifying burden.
But countering Ivan's crushing doubt is the spiritual wisdom of Father Zosima, Alyosha's mentor. Zosima preaches a radical moral vision. Every person is responsible for everyone else. Where Ivan sees isolation and meaningless suffering, Zosima sees universal connection and active love. Now, when Zosima dies and his body decomposes naturally, which totally shocks everyone who expected a literal miracle, Alyosha suffers his own brief crisis of faith. But, guided by this teaching of universal responsibility, Alyosha pushes through his doubt and rediscovers a much deeper, far more mature faith.
Finally, Part 5, an enduring literary legacy, which leads us right to the impact of this incredible narrative. You know, the book doesn't end with a neat, tidy resolution or absolute certainty. It ends with Alyosha speaking to a group of schoolboys, delivering a moving speech that encourages them to hold on to love, kindness, and a lifelong remembrance of goodness. It ends with hope.
The true brilliance of the brothers Karamazov is its masterful blend of seemingly incompatible genres. You've got the pacing of a courtroom drama and a murder mystery, the depth of a psychological novel, and the heavy weight of religious and philosophical meditation. By weaving all these together, Dostoevsky allows completely conflicting perspectives to exist in the exact same space without ever forcing an easy resolution. He dramatizes these grand, abstract ideas through the flawed, messy, real lives of his characters.
So the crucial point to take away is that this wasn't just a popular book in its day. It became entirely foundational to modern thought. This deep exploration of what it means to be human has heavily influenced an astonishing array of the greatest thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries. We're talking everyone from the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud to the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, all the way to the scientific mind of Albert Einstein and the philosophical works of Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis. They all drew heavily from the well of Dostoevsky's insights into suffering, justice, and the divided soul.
And that leaves us with one of the most enduring questions presented in the Explainer today, ripped straight from the source text and the very heart of Ivan's philosophy. Can morality exist without God? Dostoevsky offers no simplistic answers, only a timeless, enduring dialogue that forces us to examine our own souls. I highly encourage you to explore these incredible conversations for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this Explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.